Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are studying Psalm 81 today. We're going to talk about some of the feast days of the people of Israel. Don't worry, not in all the detail that was in Leviticus, but we're going to talk about the attitude that the people should have had when they were celebrating their feast days and the way that they needed to live their lives in preparation for those feast days. So that's what Psalm 81 covers, at least a good section of it. Psalm 81 was written by Asaph, and there are no known New Testament references back to 81 that I have been able to discover. For our themes, number one, celebration of the Lord's sacred days as prescribed in the law of God for Israel. And then number two, God's people fail to honor him even after being the recipients of his blessings. Two definitions. We have not seen either of these. They both appear in verse 7. Meribah. In Exodus chapter 17, Moses led the Israelites to a place called Meribah where God tested the Israelites' faith. There was no water in that place. It was, dry and desolate. God told Moses to strike a rock with Aaron's staff, and the Lord brought water out of that rock. In that same verse 7 of chapter 81, we also see this place of thunder. This one's a little less clear. There's some debate about the exact meaning, but most believe that it refers to Mount Sinai, and I think that this makes sense. This Mount Sinai was the mountain on which God gave Moses the law for the Israelite people. The description of thunder is fitting based on the description of the mountain when God's presence descended on it. If you want to read about that, you can see it in Exodus 19:16 and Exodus 20, verse 18. All right, now we look at page number 2, and by the way, if you want this outline, you can download it for free on our website. There's a link in the description. Section number 1 today is the first 5 verses, a call to celebrate the feast days. So the psalmist here, Asaph, he calls on the Israelites to worship God in the way prescribed in God's law. They were supposed to sing, play instruments, blow trumpets on these special holy days, and they weren't to neglect these celebrations because the text says that they were a statute for Israel, a rule of the God of Jacob. Now, some think that specific reference is being made here to the Passover feast because it was established while the Israelites were in Egypt. Others think that this is in connection to the Feast of Tabernacles. It's hard to say for sure. But I think generally what we need to understand is that God's giving instructions for observing his special holy days and to do it in a way that honors him. So that leads us into our second section. This is verses 6 through 16 through the end of the chapter. God heard Israel's plea. Now will Israel hear God's? So as the Israelites were preparing to celebrate these feast days, the psalmist wanted them to look back at their history and the promises that God had made to their nation in the past. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, you can read about that back in Exodus, they called out to God because of their hardship, because of their subjugation, the manual labor that they were forced to offer to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when they cried out to God, God heard their cries and he freed them by afflicting Egypt with the 10 plagues, which eventually led Pharaoh to say, get these people out of here, Moses, and Moses led them out. And you may remember some of that story. The Lord led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea, Exodus 14, to Meribah, Exodus 17, and to the place of thunder, probably Mount Sinai, Exodus 19 and 20. In exchange for hearing Israel in their time of need, God now asks Israel to hear and to heed his commands. They were to worship the Lord alone, and they weren't to worship any of the false gods of the neighboring nations. So you see what's happening. When Israel was in need, they called out to God. God heard them, and he helped them. Now, he wants Israel to listen to him and to his precepts and to live according to his law. That's not too much to ask, but the Israelites grieved God, and they didn't listen to him. God says, quote, "But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways." That's verses 11 through 13. So God gave them over to the consequences of their bad actions, their rebellion. Now, and we've talked about these consequences, like the oppression of these other nations on Israel and their nation basically falling apart because God wasn't protecting them, he wasn't helping them. We talked about that in the last chapter. So if God wasn't with them, they were falling apart. And then this was a consequence for not listening to the Lord's voice. Now the Lord was ready to deliver them at any time, according to verse 14, but not before they genuinely repented and returned to him. The text says that God had storehouses of the finest wheat and honey, and all those blessings were awaiting the people of Israel upon their return. So as the Israelites were preparing to celebrate their feast days, taking us back to the first 5 verses, as they're preparing to celebrate these feast days, they needed to keep this history of their nation in mind and to ensure that their hearts were given wholly to the Lord and that they were listening to the Lord's voice. When they had honestly given their hearts to God, they would enjoy God's abundant blessings, and their feast days would indeed be beautiful celebrations. And so that is the general summary of Psalm 81. Now let's talk about our application, somewhat shorter today, but it's because there's such I think an easy parallel to make between the mistakes of Israel and the mistakes that we often make. We can very easily make the same mistake that the Israelites made in this chapter. We can find ourselves in a time of trouble, right? We all get in those. And what do? Well, we call out to the Lord for rescue. We expect him to listen to us, and we can appreciatively receive his deliverance when he hears our prayers. But then, when our troubles are over, when the trials are past, we close our ears to God's commands. We don't bother listening to his voice. We don't pick up his word and go about our lives according to our own counsels, as the text says, or according to our own plans in verse 12. That's pretty selfish, isn't it? When we're in trouble, we expect God, we want God to hear us and to help us. And then when times are good and God is speaking to us through his word, we're like, I don't have time for that. And our Bibles collect dust on the bedroom, bedside table or whatever, because, everything's good in my life. I don't have time for God. I got other things to do. We want him to hear us when we're in trouble, but then when he blesses us and saves us and he wants to speak to us through his words, we don't have time to pick him up. So we don't want to make that mistake. In reading the admonition here and the encouragement here of Asaph, we can make sure that we don't fall into that trap.